All right, I'm going to talk to you guys about scientific investigations today, and I'm going to cover a few things. First one is how to ask good scientific questions. We're also going to look at how to identify the independent and dependent variables, which is super important and is helpful when you get to graphing your data as well, which we'll talk about later. How to write a hypothesis, and finally, how to design a controlled experiment. So how to ask good scientific questions. So scientific questions, they should be testable and they should be pretty specific. So if we're wondering like, oh, how does caffeine affect someone? That's a really good starting point, but it's very broad. So we could make that a little bit more specific, say, does caffeine affect heart rate? Okay. So now we have something more measurable that we could investigate. If we looked at what do plants need to grow? We know they need a lot of different things, but if you want to pick maybe one of those factors, and you could say, is plant growth affected by temperature? So you just want to think about making your questions a little bit more specific when you can. So that takes us to identifying independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable, which we often just abbreviate to IV, that's the variable or the factor that is purposely changed. So you say it's manipulated in the experiment. And so I think that's like the factor that's thought to maybe have an effect on the outcome, whatever it might be. So in our does caffeine affect heart rate, it would be the caffeine. We're wondering like, does caffeine do anything? And then you can change the amount of caffeine. So that would be what you are manipulating. With the plant and temperature would be our independent variable. So we could change the temperature to see if it has an effect on plant growth. The other variable that we're looking at is the dependent variable. You can think that it's the one that you're measuring, okay? The data that you're going to record when you're actually doing the experiment, and it depends on the independent variable. So it's going to change in response to the independent variable. So in this case, heart rate may be affected by caffeine, so it depends on the amount of caffeine. Or we're saying that plant growth would be our dependent variable. The plant growth is dependent upon temperature. So once you've identified the independent and dependent variables, you can then write your hypothesis, which is a testable prediction about the relationship between those independent and dependent variables. And there are a few different types of hypotheses that you can write. One that, if you ever take statistics, statisticians, and also in biology, a lot of times we use what's called a null hypothesis, which has other names. You might see it written as H0 or H0. And basically a null hypothesis states that there's no relationship between the variables. So there's not going to be any effect of changing the independent variable. The alternative hypothesis, or H1, or sometimes HA, is probably what you're more familiar with. And that's when the hypothesis is stating that there's some sort of relationship between the variables, and then you want to include a specific direction. So you can't just say like heart rate is affected by caffeine, but you would want to say like if you increase caffeine. We'll get to that in a moment. And you can write these in if-then format, which is probably what you've learned before, but you also don't need to write them. So if it's easier right now to write your hypothesis in if-then format, you can do so, but it's not necessary as long as you're including the independent and dependent variable. We'll look at some examples. So does caffeine affect heart rate? Our null hypothesis would be caffeine has no effect on heart rate. Our alternative hypothesis could be something like increased caffeine consumption will increase heart rate. Or then you could also write that if a person has more caffeine, then their heart rate will be higher. Is plant growth affected by temperature? We could say plant growth is not affected by temperature, our null hypothesis. Or we could say higher temperatures will result in increased plant growth. That typo there, no S on the end of results. Or if the temperature is increased, then plant growth will increase. These would all be acceptable hypotheses. The reason that a lot of times people like null hypotheses better is because they're the only ones that you can really prove. I know people like to say, I've proven my hypothesis to be correct. It's very difficult to do that. But null hypotheses are often easier to kind of eliminate and say, well, that's not true anymore. But alternative hypotheses can be more difficult. So let's avoid using the word prove in science. Oh, going backwards here. So designing a controlled experiment. First thing you need to do is isolate the independent variable. So what that means is that's the only thing that you want to change. Okay? Everything else you want to keep the same. That's what the idea behind a controlled experiment. And so all of the other things that may affect the outcome that you're going to keep the same in all of your different groups, those are constants. And then you should have multiple groups. You'll have your experimental group, which will receive the treatment, so receive that independent variable. And it's always good if you can to have multiple experimental groups at varying levels. And then you also, in a controlled experiment, should always have a control group, which is not going to receive the treatment or the independent variable. And the control group is kind of acting as our baseline, what we're going to use to compare everything else to. So if we look at an example with does caffeine affect heart rate, going back to that scientific question. So remember, we've identified our independent and dependent variables. So we're looking at if the amount of caffeine is affecting the heart rate. So some constants that we could think about would be, so all the other things that could affect heart rate, amount of food and sleep you're getting, exercise and activity, age, water consumption. So you could probably think of at least 5 other constants that you would want to try to keep the same. And then your control group could be people who have no caffeine. And then your experimental group, you could pick different amounts. And you say 8 ounces of coffee, 16 ounces of coffee, 24 ounces of coffee. And when you actually set up the experiment here, you could have, and it's always good to replicate, have multiples within each group. So you could have 5 people that drink no coffee, and then 5 that drink 8 ounces, and 5 with 16, and 5 with 24. And then 30 minutes later, you measure their heart rate. You can record your data, and you can find averages and see what happens. With our plant growth being affected by temperature, we're looking at how temperature, our independent variable, affects the dependent variable, height of the plant. So we've gotten a little more specific there with height of plant, not just growth. So other constants, things that could affect plant growth, the type of the plant, the soil, the water, the fertilizer, the light, etc., etc. And then you could have your control group. For this one, it's a little bit trickier. Like, you can't say there's no temperature, but maybe you pick room temperature. That's kind of our baseline, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you have maybe 4 other experimental groups, 50 and 60, and then 80 and 90. So you're looking at lower than your control and higher than your control. And so in this one, you'd have, in this case, maybe 3 plants growing at each temperature. And you could run this one like day 0, you measure the height of each plant. That also is kind of acting like a control. What's our starting height? And then you could measure the height once a week for 3 weeks, maybe, and then graph that data, and you could hopefully start to see, does temperature have an effect on plant growth? So that was kind of our very quick rundown on how you can do some scientific investigations, and we're going to get a lot of practice with that this year.